Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Elvin Turner, who is joining us all the way from England. Elvin Turner is an award-winning innovation expert and associate professor of innovation, entrepreneurship, and marketing for MBA students and executive education programs. Today, we will speak about his new book, Be Less Zombie: How Great Companies Create Dynamic Innovation, Fearless Leadership, and Passionate People. Elvin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's really great to meet you. We've been tracking a little while on LinkedIn, and it's good now to talk to you in person.
Well, I've been following the success of your book, and I see a lot of comments. I see that you are hitting #1 in many of the Amazon rankings, and that's like a drug for me. Oh, who's this guy who's having so much success? So I wonder if we could start with a little bit of your background. You have been consulting, you have been teaching, you have been speaking for a long time. I wonder who were you when you were 17 years old? Was this the future that you envisioned for yourself, or do you
My
envision
goodness,
something else?
that's not a great place to start. 17 years old, I was in a very different place. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I don't think I could have even told you what innovation was. I was probably wanting to be the lead guitarist in a band somewhere, and I was living a dream. I kind of given up on professional football by then. That wasn't going to happen. I knew that one. But no, I started out, I did a degree in international relations and French. Thought I would go into Europe, the EU or the EC or at the time, work in Brussels or something like that. And never happened. I actually got ill and I couldn't work for a while. And I found myself then in a job working for a public relations company. And I only planned to stay for 6 months because me and my friends, we were going off to Europe with our band and we were going to just waste our time really. But anyway, 23 years later, I
But
finally left that.
that's what young people are supposed to be doing. I mean, I feel sorry sometimes for the young people who follow the script of, high school, then right away
Yeah.
college, and then right away the 40 years career. I congratulations to them, but that's not too innovative.
No, I know. I think you're right. But anyway, I fell into this job, didn't think I would stay. And then I did stay. And it started out, my first job really was writing um, articles for executives in companies, doing speech writing. And that's kind of where I learned to write. And then for a long period, I did no writing. And the company moved into different spheres, and I ended up working in innovation. We retrained, hired some new people. Long story short, I ended up running the innovation practice for the consultancy for the last 7 or 8 years that I was there. Mainly working for large companies. It was global organizations, Coca-Cola, Sony Music, Cisco, places like that. And then about 5 years ago, just decided that I wanted to try something on my own. No hard feelings with the company that I left, still on really great terms with them, but I just felt there was a time in my life where my kids were a certain age, I was at a certain stage in my life, and there were some things I wanted to experiment with. So the book kind of came out of that really, but it was certainly not something I had predicted or intended to do.
Okay, so then when did the idea of creating this book came about, and what was the research that was involved in the creation of this book, and finally, what is the book about?
Well, three things prompted it, and I didn't realize this until recently, actually. The first one was when I was, this brand new employee inside this organization, having to write these articles for very senior executives. I'd go into their office and I was quite in awe of them and quite nervous and taking notes so that I could write the interviews. But as I was watching them work, as they were taking emails and calls while I was talking to them, just recognizing how difficult innovation was, how it kept slipping through their fingers, how ideas that they thought were going to work didn't work, and actually how safe people were playing it. Bold ideas were few and far between. So that was the first thing. The second was I went through a phase of running lots of leadership development programs. And some of that was around innovation, teaching people how to do innovation. But I knew that at the end of the program, I wasn't going to have any further connection with a lot of these people because they were based all around the world. And I knew that they were going to run into more problems because what we were teaching them really was good stuff. But actually, when you start to try and put innovation into practice, there are many more things that can come your way that you need help with. So I wanted to give them something. And there are loads of great innovation books out there, but there weren't any that I really felt I could recommend as a really practical, no jargon, um, based on real experience book that could help a manager, not someone who's an innovation expert, just someone who is a manager trying to get their job done, but bring in more innovation. I didn't feel there was a book out there. So I thought, I don't know, one day maybe I'll write it. And then the third thing that happened was I was running an executive education program at a business school. And we came up with this idea, it was just for a bit of fun, called Zombies versus Unicorns. So you know, we know what a unicorn is. It's a billion-dollar organization that's still scaling, really. And the other end of the spectrum, we thought, well, you know, what can we call an organization that's desperate for its next meal, that's hungry but doesn't know what, you know, it's struggling to stay alive? Well, let's call them zombies. So we ran this program, and people loved the idea. So I thought, I wonder if there's something in this whole zombie thing. So be less zombie. Being honest, I encounter lots of organizations who have characteristics of zombies, you know, zombieism. They're struggling to stay alive. They're desperate to try and find their next meal, and often they're investing in things that ultimately kill them. And that's really where the book came from. That was the final thought that made me think, well, there is a need. Here's an interesting hook. Let's see if we can bring the two together. And from there, the book was born.
Well, the first time that I heard the word zombie in relationship to a business enterprise was after the financial crisis of 2008, when there were a lot of zombie banks, banks that were in fact not profitable because, but in paper, they look like they have their accounts receivables, they were still valid, but in fact they were not valid. I mean, they were dependent on all these valueless real estate or whatever. So that was the first time that I heard about the word zombie in regards to organizations. But okay, so when you want to be an innovative organization, you have the status quo that is safe. I mean, employees know that this work, that they will not get fired if they continue doing the same thing. While if you are an innovator, the chances of success are slim. So a person who sticks out his neck and come up with a new idea, that person has a reputational risk, financial risk, and you know, they could get fired for bringing up their own idea. So how can organizations keep this innovation spirit going within the ranks?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to distinguish between different types of innovation. And I think what organizations are generally very good at is the incremental stuff. You know, what we know today, known cause and effect. We know the business model, we know the operating model. All we're trying to do is incrementally improve around that. And that happens everywhere. And in fact, usually there's too much of that going on. The innovation resources are overly dedicated to that stuff, and not enough is dedicated to the exploration and development of bolder ideas, which actually, all the research shows, have high levels of return if only we would be prepared to invest in them. And sometimes one of the problems is that as an organization, we push disruptive and incremental innovation into one space and expect teams to do both. And it's never going to work. And the reason for that is that the metrics, the culture, the rewards that you need for incremental innovation are very different to the ones that you need to encourage disruptive innovation. So in a day-to-day context, you're rewarded for certainty, you're rewarded for delivery, you're rewarded for delivering certainty, really, as you should be, because we need to keep the business running. However, when you're looking at ideas that have a very high chance of failure, because the less we know about them, the more original they are, by default, we don't know much about them. So there's a higher chance that they will fail. The metrics need to be much more around learning, identifying assumptions, testing them fast, and learning our way forward to understand, is this even an idea that we should even be pursuing? So when we try and push the two together and expect people in everyday teams to be squeezing innovation around the edge and taking risks that's not in their interest if it fails because I'm going to be penalized, no wonder people don't show up. Right. So it makes a lot of sense to separate those out so that people feel safe to deliver the right level of innovation in the right context.
Well, and is innovation always in relationship to grow, or kind of corporation be innovative without the pursuit of growth? For example, I'm thinking of the company Patagonia, who just refuses to grow, but in my eye, they seem to be an innovative corporation, always coming up with new idea of how not only to have this connection with consumers, but also how to save the environment, which is an ambitious goal.
Yeah, I like to encourage organizations to think about innovation in 3 different directions. So I talk about in pursuit of a better why, a better what, and a better how. I mean, anything that we're doing today that is in pursuit of creating value ought to be open to innovate, because the speed and scope of change is so fast and broad today that what we do today it can't possibly be the best way of doing things tomorrow, because new technologies, new ways of working are coming together to allow us to do better things if only we'll explore them. So I think growth inevitably is one big magnet for innovation, but so should operations be, so should marketing be, so should human resources and talent development. Everything can be better. It's just a decision as to whether we're going to pursue it on a deliberate, consistent, ongoing basis.
Okay, and how about your book talks a lot about leadership, and there are some leaders who are geniuses, but they also happen to be toxic leaders. And 2 of them come to my mind. Adam Newman from WeWork, who created a toxic environment, and finally he got booted out. And Travis Kalanick from Uber, that was also a very innovative, visionary leader, but his tactics or keeping his team together were perhaps not the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. And often the leader who has the original idea and is the visionary very quickly needs to step aside and allow someone else to come in from a startup perspective. But it plays out in lots of different contexts that I see. I think the most common one actually is less toxic, but equally detrimental to innovation. And that is leaders who think they've learned enough. They've figured out how this thing works. I'm 5 to 7 years away from retirement. Let's just keep things steady as they are, because we know how this thing works. We'll just keep things ticking over. We won't take any risks, because any risk that we take is actually a risk I take on my future. And that's a really hard one to deal with. And one of the things that I recommend that organizations do with their leaders is to ask them really hard questions around, to what extent does your desire for growth and your appetite for change become a constraint on the future of the whole organization? Because what you're prepared to invest in and sponsor is actually what the organization will inherit in a few years' time. So what questions does tomorrow need us to answer today? And to what extent are you prepared to demonstrate leadership in pursuing them? And I think organizations that are smarter around how they reward leaders for delivering today and discovering tomorrow are more likely to find that they've got leaders in place who can invite and encourage the right portfolio of ideas.
Okay, let's talk about how to navigate disruption. So I'll give you an impossible scenario. I'm sorry. So
Okay.
imagine that I am the owner of a successful taxi company in London. I've been improving, and I rate my drivers, and I have good customer service, and then Uber arrive and destroys my whole complete modus operandi. All my years of hard work are going down the drain. What should a leader do when they encounter disruptive, competition?
Yeah, I think it's good to zoom out, take a step back, and see what's really going on. Because usually what's happened is that a disruptive organization has identified a better way of helping your customers make progress in a particular context. That's all they've done. So if you look at the music industry, it's a really great example. If you go back to the early 1900s, the way that people would have access to their music and manage music were these big, horrible, smelly wax discs that played one song. And then we had vinyl, and then we had 8-track, and then we had tape, and then we had CD, and now we've got streaming. And the music hasn't, well, the music has changed, but my desire to want to manage music and access music, that hasn't changed. What I want as a consumer has not changed. My ability to make progress in those areas has radically changed. But what's interesting is if you look at the technology shifts between each of those stages, very few companies are successful in making the leap to the next shift. But if you look at what's going on, all that's happened is an organization has looked at, here's the progress that the customer wants to make in this context. How can we make it better in a small way or in a large way? Let's never switch that appetite off. And it's the organizations that are prepared to look at the progress of the customer as a priority rather than what they're working on, the product-centric mindset versus the progress mindset, that actually makes a differentiation. So if you look at Netflix, they don't call themselves a film streaming company. Their reason for being is we help people find great movies. Right. They don't say how they're going to do it. They don't care how they're going to do it. It used to be DVDs. Now it's streaming. You can bet they're looking already at how is this going to show up in the future? How can we help them find movies better, faster? That might be in virtual reality. It might be I'm in the film. Who knows? I mean, Netflix at the moment are the hot company on figuring out what the future looks like. The reason for saying all of this is the better that an organization can zoom back and just say, what just happened really? Is it really about Uber? Is it really about the technology? Or is it really about us taking our eye off the ball on what consumers really want? So the question to ask is, what comes next? Now, Uber can potentially fall into the trap of becoming so product-centric. All they do is make their app really brilliant and they miss the next wave that comes over, which is quite common. That can happen. And as you scale, more complexities come in and you can stutter and stumble. Now, if you're an old-fashioned taxi company, whether you've got the leadership, whether you've got the resources, whether you've got the appetite to answer the question, what comes next, that's up for grabs. You might decide to be a copycat. You might decide game over, we're just going to sell up while we can. You might decide to sell to Uber. There are all sorts of options that you can do, but to try and beat Uber at their own game, it's going to be very difficult.
Right. I find one of the problems with leadership for a long time is short-term thinking. Many CEOs, they are so concerned about beating estimates for the next quarter, and that's the whole thing. How can I shift sales and orders and whatever so I can just meet expectation and just beat by one penny like Jack Welch used to do with General Electric. And then we got leaders like Jeff Bezos who think 20 years into the future and doesn't care about whether they meet expectations this quarter or no. So I wonder how can people just take this long-term mentality that, this is where we want to be and we don't have to focus so much on the results for this next quarter.
Yeah, for me, this comes down to one key issue, which is you are what you measure. If you only really measure the short term, that's all you're going to get. And people they follow what they know their leaders really value. And very often the KPIs, the metrics are really about what do you deliver this quarter. And at one level, I don't mind that because it does focus on operational efficiency and making today really work well. But inevitably what it doesn't do is create enough capacity for the pipeline for tomorrow to show up. So what I really admire is when you see companies like 3M, who for years have held a metric that has kept them moving forward. Now, admittedly, I think they've had a blip in the last couple of years, but they seem to be turning that around again now. But for a long time before that, the metric that they have been using is 30%, well, it varies, but 30 to 40% of revenue needs to come from products that didn't exist 4 years ago. Now, if you play out the numbers, if you only do incremental innovation, that's not going to get you to that number. You've got to have much more coming through, which means you need to take some bigger risks somewhere in the portfolio, which actually means they spread their bets very high, just like any portfolio, high risk, medium risk, low risk. And leaders only get their rewards if that number is hit, which demands something of everything, particularly the higher order ideas, more risky stuff. So that what I love about that approach is that one metric motivates the environment that's required for innovation to show up to kind of snap into place behind it, because we need to be continually asking the question, what needs to be true for those big ideas to show up in terms of culture and processes and resources and capabilities. We can't just assume that today's ways of working will magically allow these ideas to emerge, because it won't happen. It's dealing in reality and saying, let's measure for what we need today and tomorrow, and bringing the two together. So I would encourage companies to think about what's a step in that direction that they can take, but it does demand that the leaders really do hold themselves to account for that number.
Wow. Okay, one last question. What do you think of the tactics that many corporations use, that instead of investing in their own research and development, they just buy nascent companies that are just beginning to flourish? So they just go into the innovation through the acquisition route. As an example could be Facebook, who bought, Instagram, or Google, who bought YouTube. So that way of innovation, not by creating, and sometimes they figure that creating a product, similar product, is too expensive and it's cheaper just to buy the competition or the innovator.
I think it's valid. I think there are some concerns that I would have about it as your only strategy. And usually when you look at Facebook and you look at Google and Cisco, who I think do this very well, they've got multiple things going on. They do their own development and research, but they also have a big partner ecosystem, and they're partnering on things, and they have acquisition. So they buy some things, and they're always looking to see what matters most. What could we do here? What will we only ever do here? What will we only ever buy? And they're very deliberate about that. Right. And usually lots of organizations aren't that deliberate. They're much more sort of making it up as they go along. But the key with that approach is you need to be really good at acquisitions. And many acquisitions fail. You know, people see the dollar signs. We've just been acquired. Now I'm locked in for 2 years, and then I'm out of here with my big check. And that happens all the time. The talent just leaves, and then what are you left with? So there is a requirement, if you're going to rely heavily on that, to be really good at retaining the talent that you're buying, because often that's what it is. You're buying some IP, but more importantly, you're buying the people who came up with that stuff and are passionate about it and know how to take it further. How are you going to keep them hooked? How are you going to keep them engaged?
Well, Elvin, this is an amazing topic of conversation, not only for business, but for our personal life, because we had to continue being innovators as well, constantly. Like, you reinvented yourself several times. I have reinvented myself a few times. I wonder if you could tell our listeners one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you?
Sure. It's Be Less Zombie is the title of the book. You can find me on LinkedIn, reach out. I connect with everybody really, because I just want to share ideas with anyone who's interested. You can find the book on Amazon and most of the bookstores, but yeah, feel free to reach out. Twitter, I'm on Twitter as well.
Okay, well, Elvin, thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's been really nice to chat with you.